thankfully, SSD does provide STL files that you can 3D print to move that motor cover forward, and I will put a link to these in the Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to the next update of my SSD Trail King build series. So since the last video, I've made a few updates. As you can see, I've added electronics to the SSD Trail King. As far as electronics go, I'm using a Hobbywing 1080 brushed ESC, and I'll put a link to this in the description below. I'm also using a Castle Creations 10 amp BEC. Up front here, I've got a 42 kg servo. It's got a metal housing and metal gears. I will also put a link to this in the description below. And right here, I have the Gearhead RC receiver bypass, and that is because I'm running a BEC. I will also put a link to that in the description below. For the radio system, I will be using a Turnigy GT5. And this is pretty much the FlySky GT5, and I will put a link to this in the description below. Here you can see the Gearhead RC receiver bypass. It's plug and play, really easy to use. Your servo goes into one end, and the other end goes to your ESC, and this goes to your receiver. So one of the things that bugged me about the initial setup of the SSD Trail King is you can see here that this motor cover is pretty far back from where it should be. And this is mainly because I think the way he created it was just to make clearance at the shock hoops and probably some clearance up front for something else. One of the problems I've seen is, there's little room depending on how you soldered your motor wires for this to actually correctly fit. It was a tight fit for me because I soldered my motor wires coming out like this instead of up at an angle. So thankfully, SSD does provide STL files that you can 3D print to move that motor cover forward, and I will put a link to these in the description below. He has them up on Thingiverse, so he's got two links right here. So for these two engine spacers, the larger one is 23 millimeters and the smaller one is 15 millimeters. Keep in mind that using these does raise the height of the motor cover, so you're going to have to take that into account as the motor cover will mount higher. Here is another issue with the way it is with the motor cover. You can see how that motor cover is a tight fit between the two shock hoops. So once you raise this motor cover up, it's going to stretch out the shock hoops outwards, and it's just not going to be a good fit. Right there you can see how it is. So to remedy that, I am also going to be installing SSD Trail King aluminum front shock hoops, and these shock hoops actually bend outward, and I think it looks a little bit more scale, especially if you had a hard body with a opening engine bay. They look pretty nice, and I'll put a link to these in the description below as well. So you can see here that these 3D printed motor cover extensions are pretty much a perfect fit. They line up great. Here's the 15 millimeter one, and this would be the 23 millimeter one. And they also line up with the motor cover perfectly as well. You can see here. See how nice that lines up? So I'm going to start off by replacing the shock hoops first, just to give me that room that I need to kind of mock up the different lengths of placement or positioning of the motor cover. Now for these shock hoops, these shocks are secured on the inside rather than the outside. So here you can see how these shocks are mounted within these shock hoops. See how it's a little bit wider, and this width should give the motor cover more clearance, as you can see here. And that also allows you to 3D print some headers for this motor cover, and it should fit between the shock hoops. With the new shock hoops installed, we can now proceed with mocking up the motor cover. So with the 23mm motor cover, we can see that the motor cover gets pushed up all the way to the front by the servo. There. And that's how much clearance we have with the 23mm motor cover. It looks great, but the only concern I have is I don't want the motor cover sitting up too high because of the body I'm going to use. And so that might be a case for using the 15mm instead, which would make the motor cover a little bit lower. So you can see here, it's a bit lower. And I think for my case, it would help keep the body that I'm going to use nice and low. And it's still pretty nice that it's moved forward quite a bit. So let's go ahead and mount the 3D printed extension. And for that, you'll need to replace the 3 screws here. These are the 3 screws I'll be using. The 2 side ones are a little bit longer than the one in the top middle. Still check the lengths of the screws here. I think this one actually might be too long. I'll look for a shorter one. Alright, let's start mounting these up. Alright. And there you go. There is the mounted motor cover onto the extension right there. And that's how it bolts up. And now you can see that the motor is moved towards the front now. And these new SSD shock hoops give the motor cover more room to work with, and you'll have room to add 3D printed headers if you do decide to do so. And that pretty much does it for this update of the SSD Trail King build series. Went over the electronics I added, as well as the SSD shock hoops that allow you to have more space for the motor cover, as well as the 3D printed motor cover extension. So thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe and hit that notification bell to be notified of the next update of my SSD Trail King. Thanks for watching.